going to get started. So glad to have you all here. And really, so there are seats in the front. I know that may not be what your dream was, but you walked in a little bit late, so you should come sit in the front. We'd love to have you. And there are a couple seats in the second row if the front is too daunting. There are more chairs. If you're really committed to not being in the front, we can bring out some more chairs. And thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Michael. Really just so honored to be able to have this conversation this morning. I guess it's this afternoon. We are joined, as you all know by now, by Dr. Beth Oppenheim, who is the new, can we still call you new?
Yeah.
New CEO of HIAS, officially as of October, but she's been interim for almost a year. And as you all know, what a moment to step into that space. We'll be talking a lot today about that and what does that feel like? What does that mean? What does the future look like stepping into this organization at this moment? Just to share a little bit about her background, which you can read much more about anywhere you look because she has really an incredible history of experience in this world. She's worked for over 20 years in refugee resettlement and international development. She's an expert on issues of displacement and sustainable systems change, focusing especially on Africa, where she worked and lived for a very long time, and in other countries around the world. And she's also worked with 2 of the U.S.'s 10 resettlement organizations, so agencies, I guess is the more appropriate term. And so she knows this work very well. She is not new to this space. And she started working at HIAS in October of 2023, which you can also imagine was another very trying time. So she is no stranger to being thrown into the fire in many ways, and she's held many different senior leadership roles in the last few years that she's been with HIAS, and she's really helped to re-envision the programmatic work and assistance for refugees and displaced people in this country and around the world, especially as it becomes more and more challenging and near impossible lately to imagine even what that looks like, and continuing to advocate against policies that are demonizing and harming our immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. She told me before, please don't read all of it. And so I'm going to keep that promise. I'm not going to read all of it. But it really is such an honor to have you with us this morning. I also want to say that she's the first female CEO that HIAS has ever had, which is, thank you, which is both incredible and sad in an over 120-year history of the organization. And so we know a little bit in this community about female leadership, and we are very grateful for yours. And our community has worked very closely with HIAS for decades, and we also, in the last few years, have been involved with some HIAS welcome circles. Will you raise your hand or stand if you've been one of the people, thank you so much, Paula, who has really organized and made that work possible for us to help resettle families here in Los Angeles who were fleeing places that at the time felt much less safe than this one, and we really are so grateful for the work that you did. And will you raise your hand if you're someone in our community who is connected with HIAS either for your own personal reasons or otherwise throughout your life? I know so many people in our community have given to HIAS, have family members who have been brought to this country through HIAS, and we are so grateful. I have been lucky enough to take a trip to the border with HIAS, and I also was in 2 legislative trips with HIAS in the last couple of years to Sacramento and to DC doing advocacy work on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers. And so we're really close to this work here and just so honored to get to have this conversation with you today. We come to this conversation, especially after a week where it feels somehow even more important than it did a few days ago. It feels like every single moment we see our refugee and immigrant and asylum seeker family being attacked and targeted in increasingly horrific ways. And it's really hard to grapple with the reality of our borders essentially being closed to people who also really need safety in this moment. And to work at an organization like HIAS, which is committed for over a century to doing that work, and then in this moment, not really be able to do it fully in the ways that you were for so long. And that's some of what we're going to talk about today. What does it look like in this moment with all of these challenges, with all of the ways in which the work is being limited to still honor our commitment to people who are really seeking safety in this moment. And I also want to say that, ironically, or sort of perfectly, our conversation is happening exactly 1 year after the executive order came down on January 24th last year that was the one that ended up cutting all of the funding to HIAS and limiting all of the work that HIAS has been able to do. And so we're here at the end of that year, and if anything, it feels like a time to sit together and reflect on what that year has been like. What does it feel like to be so limited in the work that is so important, and also have to imagine a different way forward? And so that's what it's a little bit of what we're going to try to do together today. I'm sure we will solve all of the problems of the world before 2 o'clock. So as usual, the way this will work is we'll start with some questions from me, and then at the end we'll open it up for questions from you. So if you have questions, please hold them till the end, and there will be time to answer them. I want to start with just sort of a little bit of a background question. Will you just, for those of us who may be less familiar, just tell us a little bit about the history of HIAS? How did HIAS establish itself as really a global leader in supporting all refugees around the world? And how did that come to be, and kind of where did that lead us to now? And then we'll talk a lot about now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Shabbat Shalom. It's really great to be with all of you. What a humble introduction that was. I think to start with that, maybe I'll just start with a little bit about my family, since a lot of you raised your hands. My grandfather was resettled to this country by HIAS, so whenever I think about the history of the organization, 120 plus years, I always just think about him and the impact that this work has had on me in particular. The organization started out, depending upon who you're arguing with, you may hear 150 years, 130 years, because HIAS used to be known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and then kind of formally formed itself 120 years ago, primarily serving Jews in Europe, Soviet Jews. There were essentially different waves of Jewish migration around the world, and HIAS became a known entity in safely helping to advocate for Jewish refugees wherever they needed it, from Latin America to the United States, from Europe to the United States. And then really around 2001 to 2002, the organization started to broaden its landscape. And part of that is more a reflection of what the world is, which is that the number of displaced people is at an all-time high right now, the majority of which are not Jewish, who are fleeing many different conflicts around the globe, and for HIAS to continue to teach its lived experience of Jews knowing what it's like to have to flee, needing to adapt its mission to help those continuing to flee. So really that time was when the mission changed to focus on helping everyone, Jews and non-Jews alike, depending upon how you were seeking safety around the world. And part of that grew as a result of our partnership with, I know it's hard to think about that in this moment, our own United States government, who were leaders in preventing, conflict around the world, and if conflict was occurring, offering safety for people who needed to flee it. And now that it feels like a very distant memory, but it was the case. And so a lot of HIAS's work grew out of that, helping in Israel, in Greece, when we had the refugee crisis for Syrians in Greece, and various places around the world to think about how we would lend our expertise to that. So that's a little bit of the history of the organization itself. And I think at this moment, that can feel big in terms of how the organization may not be able to do everything that it did before, but how it's sort of adapting to that. And I'm excited we'll get to talk about that too.
Yeah, thank you. And before we really jump into the heart of the questions, I also want to just take a second for you to define some terms for us a little bit. I think we talk kind of interchangeably and incorrectly often about refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. Mm-hmm. And if you could just give us a little clarity of those terms before we jump into our conversation.
Sure. I think anyone that's worked at a refugee organization has encountered this question many a time. Part of that is
worth revisiting.
Yes, of course. And part of that is because it is almost intentionally confusing, especially when it's presented in the media, especially now. So we're really talking about three categories. And I will say, I don't love categorizing. This feels like when people are seeking safety, when they need to flee, when they are seeking economic opportunity, it doesn't all feel helpful to their individual life story to put them in a bucket. But in terms of law, there are buckets. And so for refugees, that really means that they're able to document and have a well-founded fear of persecution. That persecution can be political, it can be religious, it can be ethnic or racial, and they have to prove it through a formal process. And for asylum seekers, the real difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee is actually where they are when they are making that case. An asylum seeker presents themselves at an actual border of a country where they are seeking safety and say, I have a well-founded fear of persecution, I'm seeking asylum, please, follow international law and let me in and let my case be adjudicated. That's a little bit of advocacy there. And then the third, the broad term immigrant, in many ways, all of these categories are immigrant categories, especially under law. But we all know there are other types of immigrants that move around the world for many various reasons, and that doesn't really have a relationship to them being afraid, just maybe needing to move to a different country.
Absolutely. And we're seeing so much in this moment that those categories don't matter at all in terms of the ways that people are being targeted, the ways that people are being horrifically attacked and deported in this moment, regardless of status, regardless of the fear that they have about returning to these places, that doesn't actually matter if they came here through whatever pathways, legally or however else they got here, that it isn't helping. So people who came here seeking asylum, we saw just this week with Liam, the 5-year-old boy, that his family was in an asylum process, and we see that didn't save them either from this fate.
No.
So that leads us into a little bit about this moment. You told us a little bit about the history and what HIAS was, and you came into this role, as we said, in one of the most, I think, difficult times that we've seen for this kind of work. And we see the rise of anti-immigration rhetoric, not just here, but around the world, nationalism, authoritarianism, wars and climate change everywhere, and we're seeing especially a lot of that here. What do you see as the challenges? It seems like kind of a laughable question. What are some of the challenges that you see in coming into leadership at HIAS in this moment? And also, what maybe is a positive vision that you have about what a reimagined refugee or asylum or immigration system could be for this country and for those who really want to welcome immigrants into our communities?
Ooh, two heavy-hitting ones there. Okay.
We got to end with a little hope in that question.
That's right. I agree with you. Okay, so the challenges that you laid out are challenges that everyone around the world is experiencing. The Trump effect is a real effect, but it's also not new in our history, either as Jews or, just as human beings. In terms of what the challenges are for taking leadership roles right now in an organization like HIAS, I think there are a couple. One is that you said that today is the anniversary of that stop work order, and I just kind of flashed to that moment last year. I'm joined by some colleagues who were with me for the 15 hours of that day. It's really a moment that we can remember because we knew that the entire infrastructure was crumbling. It wasn't really just about its impact on HIAS. And that means that as a leader, you have to think about that impact on your staff, on the people that you're serving, on the fact that those people are holding trauma for anyone that comes through the door, and that they themselves are therefore maybe re-experiencing trauma if they are a refugee or an asylum seeker or a former refugee or asylum seeker themselves. So as a leader, it's thinking about how you hold space for that and how you run an organization knowing that this is the lived reality for so many of us. And I actually think it's the lived reality for all of us, regardless of how we've grown up. And then the second one, I think, is in breaking through the noise. That's not unique to HIAS either, but it's one where I think our Jewish story, our history, our age really helps and is challenging to think about a legacy organization modernizing itself for the moment and thinking about how you do that. So those are a couple of the challenges. Funding, but that's,
we'll talk
third.
About that in a second.
I know. So I think in terms of this reinvention, that is the thing that gets me up in the morning and gets me excited, is the fact that a lot of us have been in this sector for decades, and the sector has looked similar in the sense that there's been evolution depending upon who's in the White House, who's in Congress, and different conflicts around the world that are making different populations more prone to seeking refugee status or asylum. But that box has remained somewhat of a box. And it shrinks if someone in Washington reduces the number, and it expands if someone in Washington increases the number. And my desire is for HIAS to be leading the drawing of an entirely new shape. We can't think that after several years of this, in the way that it's happening now, the speed, the toxicity of it, that it should be rebuilt the same. We are vulnerable in the refugee system in the sense that the president does determine the number, but we have a lot of freedom in how we can think about how communities here, as you say, who want to welcome immigrants and refugees, can take care of those people in their own communities. And that, to me, is the point of reinvention. There's also this piece, because you mentioned that I've spent a lot of time in Africa, that there's places around the world where governments have actually swung more favorable to refugees and asylum seekers. And where is HIAS in those conversations? Where are our friends in other international organizations, and how can we make sure that refugees are a part of that conversation? I think that's important too, because you can't only think in a story of migration about what's happening on this side of the border or the pond. And so to me, that's the opportunity in all of this, even though it is, I don't want to make it sound that balances everything out, but there is that kernel of reinvention that this system needs so that it's not a stop work order every 3.5, 4 years.
Yeah, thank you. I remember in the early days, right after the stop work order last year, I was on a HIAS call, and someone was explaining that the closing all the offices that you've had to close, all of the ways that people have had to really shut down the work that they're doing, is not something that is then fixable in the same amount of time, that it's much easier to tear all of it down, and then it will take something much more expansive and much more imaginative to rebuild it, because the impact of this is going to be lasting for a long time.
That's right.
And I think one of the other big challenges, as you alluded to, is funding. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I think it's the elephant in the room in a way, which is that before the stop work order last year and before these decisions were made about limiting these numbers to almost no one coming into the country, that HIAS got more than half their funding from federal agencies, from the federal government. That is not a small number.
No.
And that really has had, understandably, a significant impact on you, on your staff, on the organization, and also on the people who you have been serving, many of whom now you've had to close your HIAS offices in those countries. You've had to tell people that they aren't actually able to come. And even people who were ready to come, who had papers, who had everything in line, who were waiting for a plane and weren't actually able to come. And so I want to ask about how HIAS has changed, which again is sort of an impossible to answer question, but what has this year changed for you in light of that? And what's been lost, I think, is kind of the obvious thing. I think it's very easy to think about all of the loss that has happened as a result of that. And also, has there been anything that's been gained in terms of freedom to maybe speak more openly or advocate more boldly because you no longer are reliant on federal funding? Are you freer now in some way to speak or to act?
Okay. So yes, it's funny that you describe funding as the elephant in the room. Not for us. We live with that elephant every day. It is in all of our conversations. One of the things that I try to bring to the table in my role is never to keep from staff, donors, partners, constituents, the reality that we're facing. How could someone possibly help or invest or understand if they don't understand the breadth of the problem? So yes, HIAS did receive, I think, 56% of our total operating budget pre-24 from the federal government. That was a mix of global programs, of US programs, and I think that's important to name because some of those programs are still running, not in the same way, but they are. And it was devastating. I mean, we closed 13 offices around the country. We were able to preserve 11. And to me, that preservation was incredibly important. We didn't exactly have the long runway to do that, we had to be very creative. How do you make sure that you're prioritizing your core programming, that you figure out what that is real fast, and that you bring donors along who are not part of the US government in order to figure out how they can help you. The other thing was to make sure that people understood my pitch to any donor was never help us fill this giant cavernous hole. Like that's one, not compelling, but two, it's very difficult to even imagine the system being the same. And it's not the same that it was. It doesn't need to be. That's not the point. It's just a creative way, to your point of imagination, of thinking about that. And to make sure that we honor the loss that we've experienced as an organization. We've had to lay off a lot of staff. We've had to close offices. But I think where we've remained really strong is in being very intentional about how we do all of that. Scalpel, not hatchet or whatever. And I think that's important because you have to make sure that the clients that you were serving in X country have a place to go, figure out which partners are still operating there, making sure that the competition among NGOs is loosened up a little bit so that you can actually say, we have been serving this population, we're leaving, how can you step in? And that's something that I think we need to do more of just as a sector, but I think HIAS has done a good job at that. And in terms of the speaking out and kind of the US government's impact on our voice, so I will say that HIAS has spoken out a lot, even in Trump 1 and now. We've been one of only 2 or 3 agencies willing to sue the administration on like the second or third week. And I think that's something, and it's funny because you mentioned at the top that I worked for 2 of the 10. The other one was the other one that was the co-plaintiff. So that is my vibe.
You have good taste.
That's right. And I think one of the things that we've always done as an organization is be loud. We have a loud base, we have a loud story, we have an old story, and we have the lived experience of being Jews who have lived that story ourselves. So I would say that how I think about it now is less about the voice, but more about broadening the tent of the people who can join us in grabbing a microphone. It's not only the people who have experienced being in a welcome circle. It's not only the people who have experienced like meeting someone on a border trip, but it's people who watch something terrible on their phones and say, how do I figure out what to do next? And to me, broadening that is helping the voice that we've always had. So I want to separate that from the funding because I think we have never been quiet.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you said that.
Jews are not
We've
quiet.
never been quiet here either. So we know a little bit about that here.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about the ways that you feel like you're broadening that? When people see these things on their phones and they want to find a way in, what other avenues have you maybe created for that, or how do you see that happening?
Yeah. So I think, and this congregation obviously knows this very well, but being out in the streets and being organized and being activating of people who are maybe scared to take on that role in their own community. Like not every city is Los Angeles, not every community is like this one. There's a lot of congregations that we work with around the country who may have participated in welcoming a refugee to their community, but they don't know what to do now. And so we have spent a lot of time thinking with partners about what to do now. Part of that is this accompaniment work that a lot of us are doing, showing up, being in community with people who are going to their regular check-in with their, asylum officer or their resettlement officer, or even their case manager, someone who has been here for several years. It doesn't take that fear away of interacting with them and telling their story again and again and again. And then also giving people really clear understanding of what's happening. So just like the asylum, the asylee, the refugee, and the immigrant is confusing, the policy is confusing, and it changes weekly at this point. So making sure that we're either providing that policy analysis to our community or relying on other groups who do and elevating their voices, because we can't do it all, and I don't want to do it all. I don't think that's the point. So making sure that we understand who's listening and what they want from us, I think is key to this moment, and making them feel, just like you said, we have to end this with a little bit of hope, making sure that they understand that their activism their presence, their privilege in action is something that is the hope. That's what's there. That's what we have now, and something that we can help create for the people we've worked with for a very long time.
Yeah. I want to shift our conversation a little bit to talk about a little bit about Iran, actually, and the ways in which HIAS is connected with that. We know that you and I spoke about the fact that HIAS was really one of the organizations most responsible for transforming the demographics of Los Angeles Jewish community by really working with thousands of Jewish Iranians to come to Los Angeles. And we know that at the end of 2025, that program has now ended. And we know there were about 600 Jewish Iranians in Iran who are still there, who had sponsors mostly in Los Angeles who are no longer able to come. That is the program that allowed so many of our own community members here at IKAR and friends and family across Los Angeles to come and build a life here in the last 50 or 60 years. And our hearts lately are thinking a lot about Iran and about our Persian Jewish community here. And I just want to think a little bit about how are we sitting with that? I know you all worked so hard to preserve that program, and it has been threatened many times in the last few years, and it remained, you were able to use your leverage to keep it going for this long, but in this moment, that program has ended. And what have you learned from the process of trying to keep it going, and have you learned anything about working with the administration to try to build coalitions that they might listen to in advocating for these kinds of programs?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, for those of you who are probably maybe less familiar with this program, it is a program that has run for decades, and as you say, many of the people that, not just Jews, but there is a large Jewish population that has come through that program historically, had U.S. ties, what we call U.S. ties here in LA and in other parts of the country, that they were able to sponsor through this quiet, very diplomatically engaged program that allowed thousands of people to come here seeking safety. And obviously, this is an incredibly vulnerable population. They are not safe in Iran. They are not safe in transit out of Iran if they are able to make it out, which right now they obviously are not. And a little bit of the history there, just in the last year, that program was officially paused on January 20th, 2025, as were all refugee programs. However, we spent the last year and a few days advocating both quietly and intentionally with the Iranian Jewish community here, who may have access points with members of the administration, with allies in the Jewish community who have more access than we do to the Trump administration. Like, they know the name of HIAS, speaking of having been loud. We are not necessarily the first entry into some of those rooms or any of those rooms. And every time we've had the chance to speak about that program, particularly in a Jewish environment, we do. And the news about the kind of termination of that program, even though we saw it coming on the horizon, did not come until the very end of 2025. And I think part of my first trip as CEO was to Vienna, which is where the office is that has operated that program. I went with a colleague, and we were in an empty office building. It was hundreds of cubicles. It was very much a visual representation of the thousands of people who have come through those doors who are not there. There is a drawing on the office door that I will never forget that an Iranian had drawn, just like a kind of artistic drawing outside, that I took a picture of because he drew it in 2023. There will likely for the foreseeable future, not be people coming through those doors in any way, and we're unable to keep that program open. So we have learned, I think, a lot about the fact that the advocacy that we've done has been emotional, impactful. The Jewish community doesn't need a sell about why that program's important. We don't want those Jewish people left behind, and also the vulnerable people existing in Iran generally. But that there are real limits on what this administration will listen to put it completely mildly, and that the fact that we continue to do it And we will continue to do it. It's not that we think that this is something that isn't important to our legacy. It absolutely is. And however we can gain access points to that, we will try. I just am very clear-eyed. I know many of my colleagues in this room have worked on that program for a long time about what the reality is that currently faces us. But it doesn't mean we don't take those opportunities to talk about it as much as we can. It's hard.
Yeah. Thank you for the work that you have done and continue to do on that. And I know that our community is really impacted by it in many ways. Another thing that I think of all the crises and challenges that we've talked about so far, we have not talked yet about this sort of hurricane of this anti-Semitism, anti-immigration swirl of things that HIAS has really been in the center of, particularly since the Tree of Life shooting in 2017. And can you share a little bit with us, how has that had an impact on your work? And we're seeing, especially, of course, in the last couple of years, just this rise in both of those things, and also kind of a mobilizing in a way of anti-Semitism and anti-immigration feelings and a conflation of those things.
Yeah. So I actually gave a lot of thought to this after I was reading some of the pre-questions, because one of the things that stands out about us as an organization, or actually about any Jewish congregation or family or person that speaks out at this intersection of anti-Semitism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, is that we recognize that all this hate is intimately connected. You know, you have the rise in anti-Semitism. You have the fact that any immigrant now out there on the street feels vulnerable if they are even able to be out on the street, and the ways in which we show up for our values that say, no, it's our intention, grounded in our Judaism, to welcome the stranger and to elevate the voices of those who are more vulnerable than we are. I think that's that's how we handle as an organization the fact that we are at the center of this, to use your words. It has been hard. It is scary. I think everyone understands that what you see online is not always what is in reality, but that when that leaps off the page and turns into something incredibly violent, like the Tree of Life or the shooting in Minnesota in the fall, for me, that actually just makes me more determined that to work in coalition with other people is how we feel safe as a community. That's why we should not do this alone, and also makes us braver in the fact that each of these forms of hate, whether it's anti-Semitism or something else, needs confronting. And in that way, our work confronts it because we are demonstrating the actual power of welcome as opposed to the power of hiding or the power of being silent. I won't say that it's always easy, and I am, as a leader at the organization, constantly aware that how I may sit, whatever my positionality is different from how someone else may perceive an anti-Semitic threat or a xenophobic threat or an Islamophobic threat, and that I have a duty of care to them to show up as much as I can for the boundaries that they need in place. And we take that extremely seriously, but I don't think it has deterred us from how we interact with the Jewish community or how we interact with any community, because I believe that voice is kind of what keeps us safe.
Yeah, I think there are so many ways that a lot of what you're saying echoes, I think, what we feel deeply here, and that we work always to be broadening our coalitions and working more closely in these moments with as many people as possible, because we know that we are safer when we protect each other and when we expand those things, and isolation has never kept any of us safe. And I wonder if you'll also share a little bit about, you touched on it, but the vulnerability of also being a Jewish organization specifically, especially in this moment where we're seeing in the more progressive justice-seeking circles that there are a lot of ways in which it feels like in this country, we've felt a turning against Jews and also against refugees. And does that political backlash, I know you mostly, like us, err on the side of speak more, not speak less about these things, but are you thinking differently about how you're advocating for all immigrants, regardless of how they ended up in this country or around the world? And also, does your Jewishness or as an organization change that? I think being a visibly Jewish organization in this moment maybe carries a different kind of vulnerability than it has in the past.
I have to say, even though there is, a real and scary and not to be downplayed rise in anti-Semitism and rise in targeting of Jewish organizations, especially as you say in the progressive space, I don't think that it changes who we are or how we've approached our work. And in fact, I think it's always been there. The Tree of Life is a very visible manifestation of those things, but I work with a lot of people who have been at HIAS a very long time, and that was visible yet not new. It was different. It was a next level of something that the organization has sat at the nexus of. This is really like my second Jewish communal job in many ways. I've worked in the secular space for a very long time and in other faith-based organizations, and in some ways that orientation helps me stay right where I am, which is a Jewish person with Jewish values who has been a lifelong humanitarian. And in that way, I think I can speak about this with less baggage. Does that fair to say? And in some ways that helps the organization. And then lastly, I'll say I think that a lot of the learnings that I've had from fellow Jewish leaders has helped me to orient where people perceive HIAS to be in terms of the constellation of both advocacy organizations, but also direct service organizations. And we can't forget that we have a responsibility to serve people as much as we can, and to not limit that based on any perceptions from anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There will be time for questions, I promise. Don't worry. I actually just have one more question for you, okay, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from anyone else who has questions. This last question, maybe predictably, is an attempt to think a little bit about what a more positive vision of the future might be, and how is HIAS working right now with its supporters to give people, you mentioned accompaniment, you mentioned a couple of these things. What are other ways that you're giving people to show up in solidarity with refugees and asylum seekers in our own community and around the country, and how can we continue as a community to support you in this holy work? I know many of us are monthly HIAS donors or contribute in other ways like that, but what are you seeing on the ground? What's giving you hope, and what can you equip us with as we go back out into the world too?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think in addition to the things I've already mentioned, and I can't stress enough how important the things are that I did mention, we have a lot of resources that we've generated with fellow Jewish organizations who are maybe not refugee organizations on accompaniment and on the ways to show up. LA has that very well covered, but there are a lot of cities that don't. So if you have family members who are in congregations around the country who want to get involved in that way, go to hias.org, and there's a page for that right at the top. One of the other things I'll say is that we are constantly thinking about the ways that we can expand and connect our legal service providers. Every single refugee and immigrant and asylum seeker needs a lawyer. That's something that's a reality, and there aren't enough lawyers and there aren't enough legal service organizations who have the capacity to show up. And that's not because they don't want to or aren't working 14-hour days. It's just the system is broken, and that is part of the design. And so the other thing I'd say is we're going to be releasing a lot of resources for legal service providers in different cities. Again, LA has a lot of organizations that we're connected with, but that we can help bring congregational members into. We have a very large pro bono network of law firms that have worked with us. We will always take more. That's something that we just could fill that need within a day if we gave people cases that are coming to our doorstep, and that's a third way I think that people can get involved. We're going to continue to innovate because the ways people can get involved should change based on what's going on the ground. We see that in Minneapolis right now in a very big way. It started with documentation. It started with getting legal services on the ground for people that needed them, and now it's expanded much beyond that. And HIAS is really at the forefront of the resettlement agencies working together with the legal service agencies and with the advocates to make sure that the news stories are making sense to the people that read about them.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to open it up now for some questions. Brooke is going to come around with a microphone, so if you have a question, and just a reminder that a question ends with a question mark. Sometimes we forget. Seems only right for Paula to ask the first question. Paula really is instrumental in our welcome circle and made all of it really possible. We're so grateful.
It's on. So I was wondering more specifically, I mean, you've indicated that advocacy and legal services, but now that the flow of refugees has been stifled and you've had to close offices, what kind of other direct services are you doing here? Mm-hmm. And what are you doing abroad where you've had to close all those services down?
Yeah, thank you. So here, we work with a 26-office affiliate network. Many of you may know some of the ones here in Southern California, but they're around the country. Most of them are Jewish family service agencies, not all, but most. And they are still providing services to newcomers. People are eligible for services, whether that's housing services, educational services, workforce development, case management, up to 5 years post-arrival. And so a lot of people are still eligible for that programming, most of which is still running. Not all of it, but most of it. We are working right now with the NJHSA, the kind of umbrella network of the Jewish Family Service Agencies, to think about how, as things change, we work together to continue to provide those services, even if the funding is coming maybe at the state level instead of at the national level, and how do we work together on that? So domestically, that's still happening. Internationally, the picture has looked different. We are, as I said, still operational in 11 countries, and what we have done is really focused our efforts on making sure that if we're unable to provide services to thousands of people like we were before, because many contracts were cut, not just the U.S. government, but the United Nations, who were very dependent on U.S. government funding to survive, so that had a very big ripple effect. We're doing depth, so maybe several hundred people in X location receiving legal services or mental health and psychosocial support services instead of thousands. But if we're there, we're doing the comprehensive service delivery that they need, so that we're not leaving gaps in just existing kind of on a shoestring budget. And then I think we've done a pretty good job through our partners, particularly in Europe, of engaging the European donors on helping to support some of that international work, so that it's not just having to reduce, but in some cases focusing on refugees who may have been originally designated for resettlement in the United States. Now they don't have a pathway. It was closed to them, and it doesn't look like under this administration it will reopen. And so thinking about providing those services where they are, instead of being able to bring them here.
I have a question. I'm Persian. Let me read it. So Trump's put the name of Iran between those 19 countries. So I do have a lot of Jewish friends in Iran and also Baha'is. So what's the situation right now? Are they able to apply for? Because Trump's the current administration's stopping any asylee or other everything. But how long it's gonna last?
Yeah, so the question was about Iranians being able to have any kind of application or pathway right now. Right now, the answer to that is no. We have been working behind the scenes to try and think about any kind of mechanism for maybe a referral to a third country, but that is a complicated process, and nobody is leaving Iran easily, if at all. And so that is something we're still actively engaged in, but the short answer is unfortunately no. And we are continuing to monitor what people are hearing, even though a lot of folks inside Iran will not be as open on telecommunication channels about what they're experiencing. We do try and meet with as many members of the Persian community here to understand what is going on, if we can get intelligence and we can kind of move that to the right place. But applications-wise, applications now are no longer being accepted to that program.
Hi, what is HIAS's relationship with the government of Canada in terms of resettlement?
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
us, or?
So, yeah, fair enough. So there's a couple. One is that HIAS has a partner organization called HIAS. That's really the name. In Canada. Much of what they're doing is serving people who are on the Canadian pathway. Under Trump 1, and I was involved in this from my position at another resettlement agency at the time, we had a lot of conversations with Canadian organizations about what we call complementary pathways, so people that come to the country by being a student or by being on a particular workforce development program. And those pathways in Canada, although now under new leadership, maybe we will see something different, have been limited. I mean, they are now, though. I sat in a room in Geneva. Mark was there. Hi, Mark. And we listened to folks present on the largest resettlement country being Canada. And that was, of course, because the U.S. program is shut. And so I had this moment of being like, well, I've never heard that talking point in my life. That is an interesting, statistic. We continue to think about how we can do advocacy to refer people from the U.S. pipeline to the Canadian pipeline. It's not as easy as it would seem because there are security differences and because we are a little bit unliked right now in the global community, but the NGOs are talking to one another, and I think that's the important point. And the Jewish community we are in touch with in terms of what they're experiencing, what they're seeing, and how they might be of assistance to us if we have particular cases overseas that we might want to refer to them.
Thank you for being here. I want to follow up on the Canadian question. You know, there are 3 other major English-speaking countries. There's New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. Is there any similar effort going in conjunction with them?
Yes. So there was a program that existed under the previous State Department that worked with different countries, not just those that you named, but several others, to refer cases from the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program pipeline to third countries. And we were a part of that alongside 2 other agencies. And we're still having that dialogue. One of the things that we're working on is trying to think through how the UN can be a partner there more loudly in the diplomacy that's required to get people to increase their numbers. There was a meeting in June, this past June, where we talked with other countries, but not only the ones you named, about taking those cases. It is a bit of a challenge, and part of that is because, unfortunately, refugees are caught up in this, and some of them are perceived by the countries in which they are. Maybe they're a country of asylum, maybe they're somewhere else, and as having been almost tainted by being in the resettlement pipeline to the United States, and what does that mean? And now they have to kind of start their journey all over again. So it's an advocacy effort, but it's also kind of a behind the scenes, where can the UNHCR play a role? I'll say that I'm very interested in what's going on right now in Brazil. Brazil is obviously not an English-speaking country, but it is one that is being highlighted both at the international level, but also at the local level, for having an increase in what we call community co-sponsorship, right? The welcome circles model, other types of private welcome, and they're welcoming Afghans, they're welcoming Ukrainians, they're welcoming Somalis, and they're doing a fabulous job. And so what can we do as experts who have done this for many years to help countries like that understand what their needs might be and how we can help meet them?
Okay, we're going to close here, even though we could be here all day. Before we do, can I just have the other HIAS staff also raise a hand or just stand for a second? Thank you all so much for your sacred work. And to Mark, who was the longtime CEO before Beth. And so we really have an honor of 2 HIAS CEOs in the room. can't say that very often. Thank you for all your years of service. And really, I just want to bless all of you, but especially to you in this moment, Beth. Just it takes a certain kind of courage to step into the fray in this moment when I think most people would step away or step back. And it's not lost on us that this is the moment that you stepped in. And as I said at the beginning, to be the first female CEO of this organization in this moment, and to be someone, all of you, who really are coming closer to crisis instead of backing away from it. And I think that that is such a model for all of us of what we all need to do in this moment. It may not be that we all could be the CEO of HIAS, but we can find our own way to step forward instead of stepping away. And I just bless you all with continued strength and clarity of vision, and also faith and commitment and hope that there is a better world possible, that there is a different future. May we all ideally live to see the day where some of that comes to fruition. We are so honored to be in this work with all of you. I really see us as partners in this sacred work. We're so grateful. Please know that you have so many of us in your corner here. Please don't hesitate to call on us however we can step in to support you. It's a long road ahead, but glad we are together in this fight. Thank you all so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.